I'm not going to do this for every page of Ulysses, but I did want to do a close reading of the first page of the novel just to give beginners of the book a sense of what's going on and just an easy way into reading this story. Out of all the chapters in Ulysses, this ought to be the easiest to read just because it is written in a traditional style of a novel, a third person narrator. It has characters, it kind of has a plot, it's filled with dialogue, people are talking. It's in a way a very conventional style for a novel. And that's really what Joyce wanted to do, was to lure his reader in, give the reader a false sense of safety so that he can dazzle them later on with his linguistic pyrotechnics. Now, what's happening on this first page? The trick with this first chapter is that a lot of what's discussed in the chapter has happened even before the book has begun. What do I mean by that? Well, James Joyce's first novel was a novel called The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And Stephen Dedalus, who's the main character in the first three chapters of Ulysses, is the main character of that book. And there's a lot that goes on in that book, but basically it talks about his experience at the Glasgow School, which is a Catholic school. And throughout the book, Stephen Dedalus is dealing with his angst about growing up, about masculinity, specifically his sexuality in relation to his feverish religiousness and his conflicts with his religious identity. And so the status of Stephen from that book, moving on to the beginning of Ulysses, what has happened is that Stephen has basically renounced his religion. He went to Paris, which is a very different city from Dublin. It's a lot less repressed in a sexual way. It's a lot more full of culture and art, and that's really what Stephen is trying to embrace, trying to get away from religion and get into the world of being an artist and trying to create art that really speaks to people and will establish his name in history, something that Stephen also has a lot of difficulty with, this issue that history is a nightmare from which he's trying to awake. And so with that background, it's easy to understand what's happening here. Buck Mulligan, who is the roommate of Stephen Dedalus in the Martello Tower, which is this tower near the Sandymount Beach in Dublin. And what's happening in this first page is that Buck Mulligan is imitating the introit of the Catholic Mass, which is basically where the priest is walking up the altar of the Eucharist. It involves chanting, which is what this introibo stuff is. And specifically, he's doing this in order to mock Stephen, specifically mocking the fact that Stephen was so feverishly religious before, has given up on that, and now is trying to become an artist and is clearly failing at that too. Later on, Buck Mulligan will call him the Bard and will make fun of him for that, for trying to imitate Shakespeare, and oftentimes makes fun of Stephen's love of Shakespeare, and specifically of Hamlet and his theories about Hamlet. And if you wanted to stick to the parallel of Ulysses and Hamlet, Buck Mulligan is kind of playing the part of Claudius here. He's Stephen Dedalus calls him an usurper, which is the last word of this chapter. He's kind of placing that feeling of displacement and exile onto Buck Mulligan, who's trying to isolate him, make him feel embarrassed about himself. And specifically later on in this chapter, Buck Mulligan is trying to get Stephen out of his funk, out of his grief for his dead mother. And he kind of doesn't understand why Stephen is so wrapped up in death and can't get over the death of his own mother. And the way you can think about this is that Buck Mulligan is a medical student, so he sees death on a daily basis, and he kind of has almost a comedic, nihilistic view of death, where Stephen takes it very, very seriously. As Buck Mulligan says, he takes it deathly seriously and sees death as kind of wound up in all of this existential angst and importance, and what does it mean to be an artist, and all those deep questions with which Buck Mulligan makes fun of. One thing that I've talked about in previous videos is how James Joyce takes the method of Buck Mulligan and incorporates it into his own writing. And I said that this was the main technique used in the later chapters, but you can actually see it happening in this first chapter. Think about it this way. Stephen Dedalus wants to become an artist, specifically a novelist, the person who can write a book like Ulysses. And one can imagine that the kind of novel he would write at this point in the story would be one that's very traditional, that's trying to impress people with academia, big words, and things like that, and probably wouldn't come out too well. It'd probably be kind of awkward, not really grounded in anything real. And that's kind of what this first chapter is, trying to model what would be the kind of book that Stephen Dedalus would write, specifically a bad book. Something that a lot of people don't realize when they're reading this first chapter is how poorly it's written. And actually, when Ulysses was first published and reviewed, a lot of reviewers shat on James Joyce because how poorly the first chapter is written. And what do I mean by that? Well, just look at the use of adverbs in this first page. There are so many adverbs, there's almost an adverb for every sentence. A yellow dressing gown, ungirdled, was sustained gently. Halted, he peered down the dark winding stairs and called up coarsely. Solemnly he came forward. He faced about and blessed gravely, leaned his arms on the top of the staircase and looked coldly at the shaking, gurgling face, which is a repetition of a sentence right before it. Back to barracks, he said sternly. And even just the grammatical structure of a lot of these sentences is really awkward. Let's take the first sentence, stately plump Buck Mulligan. Those first few words already arranged in a way that's very awkward, clumsy, and not particularly artistic or elegant. Came from the stairhead instead of just went down the stairs, bearing a bowl of lather on which a mirror and a razor lay crossed. Instead, he could have just said, holding a bowl with a mirror and a razor on top of it. Halted, he peered down the dark winding stairs. And so you can see kind of the awkwardness of this writing. It doesn't flow at all. And that's kind of what James Joyce wanted, is for the writing to be quite bad, because this is the kind of writing that Stephen Dedalus would produce at this point. And so we can see already in this first page this self-reflective making fun of traditional literature that James Joyce is doing. On one hand, he is writing a very traditional third-person indirect discourse chapter, but at the same time he's making fun of that method, trying to set up the problem of the novel, which is how do you make art that's really grounded in reality and can really connect people, and incorporate all the things that makes great art. And it's so interesting because there is a lot of artistry in this chapter, in this first page, but at this point in the story, it's all hidden in puns, in very hidden references that you would need something, secondary sources to identify, or a professor to identify. Even just taking the pun, dark winding stairs, which is a pun on the Odyssey of the wine dark sea. And maybe Joyce is trying to make a point here about religion, comparing religion specifically with these ceremonies in Irish Catholicism with the sort of awkward, ungrounded, top-down method that he's showing in this narrative technique, something that doesn't connect people, that instead tries to control them, tries to manipulate them. And maybe what Buck Mulligan is trying to do is try to loosen Stephen out of that mindset, to try to get him to see outside of himself, which is also what Hamlet's issue is. So I hope that was helpful. I didn't mean that to be a comprehensive line-by-line reading of this first page. I think that would just take too long. From now on, the videos are going to be kind of jumping around the book, talking about different topics that I find interesting, that I find encompass the entirety of the major themes of this novel. So hopefully those will be more helpful as you're trying to read through this book for the first time.